we're
Good morning.
30. Thank you all for being here today. We're really excited to have Dr. Geoffrey Dilly here to talk to you. Dr. Dilly is the associate professor at CSU Channel Islands, has been a professor for 10 years at the Channel Islands University, and in addition to our presentation today, I hope you join us on May 6th. We'll have Dr. Mayberry discussing who wrote Shakespeare. Is Shakespeare really the true author of all the works that are attributed to him? But I won't steal any light from Dr. Dilly's presentation today, Peering into Darkness, Exploring the Deep Sea. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Dilly, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, hold your applause till you find out. So thank you all for coming. I am Dr. Dilly. Jeff, it's fine. You are not my students here. But I did like to sort of give you a very brief version of a course I teach at Channel Islands, which is Deep Sea. That's a 15-week course. It's got midterms and finals. I will not have exams during this, probably. And I sort of wanted to walk through both my personal experiences with this. My PhD was working with hydrothermal vents, and also just sort of broader questions, because I think it's an environment that is not thought about often. We discard it. We think of it as far away as outer space. But I want to impart to you by the end of this 40 minutes that it is part of our ecosystem, it is part of our planet, and in fact, it is more tied to us than you might know. So, just as the basics, I'll go over, what do we quantify as the deep sea? Where does the deep sea start? It's a bit of a squishy term, but we basically can tell you that it starts wherever photosynthesis ends. So, if kelp can't grow there, it's probably called the deep sea, which is most of the ocean. And then we'll talk about some cool adaptations that organisms that live in the deep sea have, and they change as you get deeper and deeper, because the deep sea is a vast and broad and different environment. It's sort of like saying the land, right? And it's even more broad than that, because the deep sea is far bigger than all terrestrial space on the planet combined. I'll talk about some really amazing specialized environments, one that I have a lot of work in, that's hydrothermal vents. And then one maybe you've heard of or not, which are whale falls. They're entire ecosystems that build off of whales that have died and sank to the bottom. You wouldn't think that a single skeleton could support an ecosystem, but they're big enough, they really can. And then I'll talk a little bit about some human impacts, because it's always important, especially to an environment that we don't think about, to remember that things that we do actually do change the deep sea. Many of the things that are changing our planet globally are happening in the deep sea, but there are some specific challenges that they face, and I'll go through deep sea mining, which is sort of a very current and important topic that I don't think is getting enough press. And then I'll end on a lighter, happier note, show some fun photos, some personal experiences with the deep sea vehicle DSV Alvin, which is probably the most famous of human-occupied vessels, but there are others, and hopefully give you some time for questions and answers at the end. All right, so if we start, it's a little hard to see because it's a smaller screen, but the word pelagic basically just means open water. That's anything that you'd have to be swimming in, and so you'll see the suffix pelagic applied to each of these zones as we go down in depth. Epipelagic is the only area that sunlight actually penetrates to, and it's pretty shallow. It's only about 300 feet. That's within scuba diving range. You can get to the bottom of the epipelagic. You can, in fact, yourself, without too much training, dive into the beginning of the deep sea. You certainly can't go very far into it, though, because below that we call it the meso, or middle pelagic. The mesopelagic is called the world of twilight. And if any of you have watched The Twilight Zone, that's kind of where the inspiration for the name comes from. It is a world of, it's called the Twilight Zone. It's a world where there's some light but absolutely not enough to support algae or photosynthesis like that. Below that, we have the bathypelagic. Bathy just basically means deep. This is the majority of the deep sea ocean, but it gets even deeper. We have the abyss, the abyssopelagic below that, and below that we have a zone called the hadal, or hell zone. Now the hadopelagic is not hot. It's not named that for heat. It's actually named that simply because they are trenches or deep sea canyons. It's anywhere that actually cuts even deeper into the ocean. You'll see that the animals that you find there, and they are only animals, right? Plants don't exist. Plants basically don't exist in the ocean. There's only a few species of seagrasses that are in the very, very shallow areas. But there are algae in the epipelagic, lots of it. You know algae is kelp. You have a lot of algae up here, but below that, it's only animals. And bacteria, of course, archaea. But mesopelagic, bathypelagic, abyssopelagic. And the relative number of animals you're seeing on that screen is reasonable. As you get deeper, life gets rarer. It gets weirder too. But one thing, again, I want you to take away from this is that it's not separate. This is not a different this is not a different world. It's a different part of our planet. And it's connected because all of the surface water, all the water that is right there that you can see up there, moves around the planet. We have massive ocean circulation, but we also have vertical circulation. The same molecule of water that could be in Tahiti at the surface will eventually be in the bottom of the ocean. And the reason that happens is because eventually water will transit either to the Arctic or the Antarctic when it's cold, and from density, we know that colder things get more dense and it starts to sink. So the water that sinks makes its way all the way to the seafloor. But if there's a bunch of water pushing this way, the only way they can do is sort of push towards the middle. And when they reach the equator thereabouts, they start to push back up. And so like a lava lamp, you kind of start making this up and down motion, circulating. This is thousands of years though. A single molecule of water might take 10,000 years to do one complete circuit. It is not fast and it is far. But I want to make sure that you understand that all of the oxygen, all of the carbon dioxide, all of the other gases that we are making and changing on the planet will make it to the deep ocean because it goes with the water. Some fun, interesting, crazy facts about the ocean. 97% of all water, here's part of the 3%, are in the ocean. Of that remaining 3%, 2% are locked in glaciers. Only 1% is free and available as water for us. So 97% of all water is in the ocean. The deep sea is 90% of all livable space on the planet. All your mountains, all your deserts, all your tropical rainforests, all your coral reefs, all of your kelp forests, that's all 10% of the planet. 9 out of 10 areas to live in is part of this. So again, it is not an environment you think much about, but it is the majority of our world. The average depth of the ocean is 2.5 miles. If you were to smooth out the entire planet, take down the Himalayas and the Rockies and all that, flatten everything, the ocean would cover the entire planet 1.5 miles deep. That's how much water we've got. The deepest spot on the planet, probably have heard of this, is the Mariana Trench. That is about 35,000 feet. And for, I think, most of your benefit, I've translated meters mostly to feet on this. So I usually think in meters, but I have to back reference for feet here. So 35,000 feet depth, that is higher, if you were to flip it, than 747 would be flying. So it is that deep from the surface. The pressure down there is 8 tons per square inch. So those massive pickup trucks driving around, you get 2 of those per square inch on your entire body. That's how much pressure is pushing down. And in comparison, you could drop Mount Everest in there and still have 2,000 feet before you got to the surface. Speaking of Mount Everest, I know it likes to be claimed as the tallest mountain on the planet. It's not. It's only the tallest mountain if you consider sea level. If you think of a mountain growing from where it starts, Mauna Kea, which is the big island of Hawaii, is bigger. It grows from the seafloor all the way out, and it's more than 8 miles tall, which is several thousand feet taller than Everest. The ocean is very salty. About 5 trillion tons of salt that have mostly eroded from rocks on the planet have spread around in there. If dried and spread evenly, it would cover the entire planet 150 feet deep in salt. So it is quite salty. But on a planetary scale, this is my favorite fact here, the ocean is insignificant. All of our living space is insignificant compared to the size of our planet. That little grade school map there that you could spin around, probably have a globe in here somewhere, it's like that. The paint that they paint around is thicker in comparison to the rest of that globe than the ocean is deep at its deepest part. Most of our planet is the mantle and the core, right? That crust is so thin on our planet. So proportionally, that paint on the globe is thicker. If we get below the epipelagic, things still look pretty similar at the beginning. They look pretty much what you'd find. This is krill, those are copepods, those are ostracods, they're called seed shrimp. They're all arthropods, they're all pretty common zooplankton that we would find, and they form the base of the community. Now, you probably learned at some point that primary consumers, or things like herbivores, make up the base of the food chain. That's true anywhere that you have algae that you could eat. But when you get deeper into the water, you are waiting for that stuff to sink down. So we sort of consider these animals that consume algae as the base of the food chain, not the algae itself, because the algae has to come from somewhere else. The fish that you find in the midwater zone, they're pretty small on average. There's not a lot of food. There's not as much as you'd find shallower, so one of the main adaptations to living at that depth is to get smaller. Not all of them though. You do have some big hunters. This is called a lance fish, 215 centimeters, so that is from floor to here. So it's maybe 7 feet long, pretty big fish, but they are not that common. The really common ones are called bristlemouths, which you see over here. It is also the most abundant genus of vertebrates anywhere. There is, some models estimate 1 quadrillion, which is 1,000 trillion individuals of this. So much that they are absolutely the sort of currency trade of food in the ocean. Everything eats cichlid bones or bristlemouths. One of the other weird things is if you're in the twilight zone, there's still enough light. There's not a lot of light. So you need to make use of every photon that comes your way. If there's a great line from Princess Bride where they go, he's mostly dead, he's not totally dead. Totally dead I can't work with. Mostly dead, we can work with that. It's mostly dark. It's not totally dark. If there are no photons of light, you don't need eyes, right? There's no light in the bathypelagic, but in the mesopelagic, you can see. So what's one way to see? Make your brain translucent. That's a barrel-eye fish, pretty famous fish. It's made the news because it's a weird-looking fish. What you're seeing here are 2 sets of retina. You have one set of retina, and they face forward, and they make a nice 3D ocular image. They have 2 sets. One that gives them a relatively broad but unfocused lateral visual field that's seen around you. One that's a little more specific is a upward visual field, so they can see up. That's really cool because usually you hunt up. You're looking for a silhouette. It's light up there, it's dark down here. Something swims over you, might be food. Of course, something bigger is also looking for you, even deeper. So you want to be defending yourself against that. How do you defend yourself against a bigger predator? Break up that silhouette. Now, any fish you've ever caught or seen in the market, you've already probably noticed that their dorsal, their back is dark, and their ventral, their belly is light. That's passive countershading. Because, again, looking up, it's a little bit lighter against the light, it's a little bit darker against the dark. That's a good camouflage. But you can use active camouflage. Active camouflage comes in the form of bioluminescence. Now, bioluminescence has a lot of usages. It's definitely its own talk. in there. But one of the best usages, and one of the most obvious ones, is many fish have them along the belly. They have them along the ventral side, so that if you're looking up, you have enough light that the silhouette is broken up. It's like a stealth plane flying over, having active camouflage so you can't see it against the sky. And in fact, the military actively studies these as ways for inspiration for making their own camouflage. So a lot of midwater animals will have these photophores going along, these little light patches going along their belly, and activate them. And there's some really cool specialized ones. They can have skin flaps that can open or close so you can let more light in. Because you can imagine you might want to have them relatively bright if it's noon, but you'd want to have them off if it's midnight, because looking up would be dark, and then you're just a flashlight, right? That would make you more visible. So they can actually adjust these as well. Fish are not the only things that have bioluminescence. In fact, what's really neat is more than 70% of all animals living in the midwater zone do have bioluminescence in some form or another. Squid have photophores that are so interestingly spread out that if you're in a submarine and you know your stuff, you could probably ID the species just from the light pattern, because they have unique ones. And in fact, the squid can do it too. They know if it's their own species, which is important because it's hard to find a date when it's really dark. So you want to know if that's your same species or a competitor. Now, squid don't tend to eat each other. They can, but they mostly stay out of each other's way. But they use it to sort of find mates as well. You can see vampire squid. Now, vampire squid they get a bad rap. They're actually super mellow squid. They're one of my favorite animals. Vampire squid are the only member of their entire order. They're not actually squid, we call them that. They're squid, they're an octopus, and then vampire squid is like really far away. So they're the only living member, and they're filter feeders. They just use these big webbed arms to just get water and tiny things in. They're not active hunters. But on the ends of each one of their arms, they have these nice lights. And those lights they use to actually attract those little krill that we saw earlier. So the krill think that maybe these are little yummy diatoms and dinoflagellates and algae. And so they come swimming towards them, and then they just sweep them into their mouth. What if your meal is big? No problem. Unhinge your jaw. Snake can do it okay. These can do it better. So that's a viper fish. That's a rat trap fish. They have relatively similar jaws. You might have seen gulper eels or whiptail eels, all the stuff that you might see in Finding Nemo or something like that. They are based on the fact that they have these extremely enormous jaws that can completely unhinge. And some of these species can eat things that are 2 or 3 times their own body mass, expand their belly, and have a single meal every year or so, right? Because if you're only getting food when you can find it, you want to make sure that that meal isn't going to pass you by. So mesopelagic predators, believe it or not, still focus mostly on vision. Even though it's really dark, it's not totally dark. So having those big tubular eyes, having bioluminescence, having camouflage, and most cool, having transparency. A lot of the stuff that you'll bring up on a midwater trawl will be totally clear, except what you can see in the guts or maybe the bones. Or they'll have, what's I think is most interesting, the deeper you go, the more we start to see bright red. That's because bright red is a color that filters out in water very quickly. I can tell you as a diver, if you get to 40 or 50 feet, you can't really see red anymore. It just looks like a dull brown. And by the time you get even deeper, it just looks black. So bright red actually becomes a nice camouflage color. Not everything stays in the midwater zone. A large group of them actually swim to the surface every night. It is the largest migration on the planet. Bigger than any of those wildebeests or anything else. The largest migration on the planet is a lot of these group that go to the surface every night and they hunt up there because there's a lot more food at the surface, and then they go back and hide. So they hide during the day when it's bright, and they rest and digest, and then they actively hunt. Some groups said, well, that seems a lot of work. What if I just eat you when you're trying to rest? So there's a whole bunch of ambush predators that are slightly larger, but much flabbier. They don't need a lot of muscle mass to do that because they just need first movement, right? So there's these groups, the saber-toothed fish, which you can see its teeth have inspired that name. Now those teeth are actually really, really soft. The angler fish, you might have seen it in Finding Nemo, those big scary looking teeth, you could fold those. There's almost no ossification. There's no bone mass down there because there's so little nutrients. They're mostly meant to trap. They're just trying to break them out. It's like a cage. So they get stuck in there and then slowly get digested, which seems worse than being chewed to death, to be honest. But yeah, a lot of these fish that are smaller, they will go up and down. Story you might have heard is that they are so thick at 500 meters, 1,500 feet, that they form this thing called the deep scattering layer. And when sonar in World War II was first getting worked out, they couldn't figure out why they kept seeing a bottom where they knew there wasn't a bottom, false bottom. So they kept pinging and getting this layer. And it was actually the biology. They were hitting so many fish, so thick, that it looked like the seafloor. And so obviously sonar has progressed, so you don't get that anymore. But now fish finders use that to be able to actually find fish that you're hunting for. All right, so what if we went deeper? Until just 1977, we thought that photosynthesis was the entire energetic basis of food everywhere on the planet. We know that photosynthesis forms the basis of terrestrial food webs. Your photons, CO2 and water make sugar and oxygen. Easy. You make your plant, you make your cow, you make your steak. You can do that in the ocean too. Your phytoplankton makes your zooplankton, makes your fish, makes your bigger fish. That's even true in the deep ocean. Your phytoplankton, they die and they rain down detritus, bacteria, phytoplankton. They will rain down, we call it marine snow. And it has this filtering material that slowly makes its way into the deep ocean. And that's why most of the deep ocean has very little abundance, right? Or very little biomass. You don't have a lot of organisms down there because it's just waiting for this very slow rain to come down there. Until 1977, we thought the entire deep sea floor kind of looked like this, and why a lot of people weren't that interested in going to visit it, because that's a little boring. We called them deserts, which is still, we found out, high in biodiversity. Really interesting, lots, millions of species. Maybe more biodiversity than on all land is found here. Because in certain areas, you might think that one worm you find anywhere, you'd find anywhere on the planet. But that's really not true. The species that you'd find off the coast of California are different than that off the coast of Baja or Oregon, and so on. Multiply that by the entire size of the ocean, and you're talking biodiversity in millions of species, rivaling that of any of the other highly productive environments, your coral reefs, your jungles, so on. But, don't know what happened. Stand by. There we go. In 1964, we decided maybe we should see a little bit more about this environment. So this was a joint project between, at the time, General Electric and several other corporations and the US Navy. And they built a submarine in coordination with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute called Alvin. Alvin, you probably have heard the name. You might not know why it's called Alvin. I didn't. It's named for Alan Vine. Alan Vine was the chief engineer who designed the shape of this. And so Alvin is just a portmanteau of Alan Vine. In here is a titanium sphere. At the time was the largest single piece of titanium ever constructed. Still is. And then you have mostly ballast. You have some thrusters on the side. This they call it the sail. Inside is a hatch. Obviously it's closed, but that's also where the ladder is to get in and out in there. This is Alvin today. In 2015, they commissioned the third generation of it, so it's quite a bit bigger now, but it's still basically the same idea. Here's their titanium sphere. Your thrusters are now more maneuverable. You have several in the back, whole bunch of cameras, and a front deck where you can load samples, deploy equipment, and so on. And Alvin was commissioned for a really important geology question in the 1970s. and that was about plate tectonics. Weirdly, a widely accepted belief now was still not empirically confirmed in the 1970s that we have plates that move around. There was a big schism in geology about understanding that. We've now mapped all of the plates on the planet, but they were looking for evidence on the seafloor of volcanoes, of earthquake faults, of mountains, of hot springs, anything that could give them evidence that these things were moving around and shaking. And so they go, there's original Alvin and a moon pool on the original Atlantis, not a very comfortable ship. It was it was a converted oil derrick. They took the derrick off the top. It was a drilling ship, and they just placed Alvin with a couple of ropes in the middle, and they would drop it right through the middle of the ship and then pick it up every day. So in 1977, they go to the Galapagos Rift, off the Galapagos, and they start surveying the undersea ridges. And imagine their surprise when they saw this. Never seen before I guess it's a white smoker there, or maybe it's a black smoker. Hard to know, but the color of the smoke is dependent on the minerals that are shooting out. They see that, but imagine their absolute shock when they see this. High density life and gigantic animals. Crazy to see. That is the iconic giant tube worm there. And we know now, after that trip, that there are hundreds of these hydrothermal vent sites, many of which are specific to regions. You only find some animals in some places here. There are many right off of our west coast, a bit farther north, where Seattle, Vancouver area, that's where I did my research. There's some down in Baja. They're actually in the Gulf of Mexico, where Baja splits from the mainland of Mexico. That is a rifting zone, so there's interesting, cool species there. There's a whole bunch down off of South America. There's some in the Indian Ocean, and a whole bunch along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is the spreading center between, Europe and Africa and North and South America. There are plenty of these smokers, and they support a huge diversity of life. They're really, really abundant life there, on the order rivaling the productivity of any coral reef, of any tropical rainforest. In fact, probably higher, more animals per square inch than you find pretty much anywhere on the planet. But they're small. The size of this library is probably already bigger than most vent fields. So there's these extremely rare, extremely valuable biological resources that are littered within this desert that is thousands and thousands of miles. When I say high biomass, I mean it. This is, oops, I don't know why that skipped. This is a picture that one of our software took of just a single area. This is about this big, of different animals that you can find. I welcome you to come up here later. These are a couple of the tubes. These are the tubes. Now, the worms themselves are long gone, rest in peace, but these are the tubes that they actually lived inside. The animals create their own tubes. We do have one example of a worm, very much not alive, in there as well. So these animals form these really rich communities. Whole bunch of different things. You find lobsters, you find crabs, you do find fish, you find gigantic clams, huge clams, and all sorts of worms there. And the question is, how could you have this much life, this deep, this far away from the sun, without photosynthesis? And the answer is chemosynthesis. There's an entirely new source of energy for life that was discovered at the hydrothermal vents. They do exactly what plants do, which is turn carbon dioxide and sunlight. They get their energy from sunlight. That's the photon, charges everything up, allows them to break carbon dioxide. That's really the goal. Carbon dioxide has a really strong double bond. Breaking the carbon off the oxygen is hard to do, but if you give it enough energy, you can split it. You can take the carbon and you can make sugar out of it, and then you can also get oxygen. So that's what plants do. That's why they give off oxygen. Here, they use chemical energies. They're using the energy from oxidizing sulfur or methane or any of these other things that are shooting out of the vent, and they use that to break carbon dioxide. a lot of those animals that you saw there, they actually host them as symbionts. So they have symbionts living inside them, like a coral does with an algae, and they actually get the energy that way. Others feed on them. And once we discovered that these chemosynthetic organisms exist in the deep sea, we knew what to look for, and we started finding them other places. We found them in these cold seeps. Cold seeps are actually still pretty warm. They'd be very pleasant to swim in if they were not crushingly high pressure. You find these in the Gulf of Mexico, and they're about 30 C or maybe 80 degrees. So kind of nice to swim in. And they have these communities that are based off the oil that is bubbling up, and the methane that's naturally bubbling up and has been off of that. That's why there's a whole bunch of oil platforms there, because it naturally bubbles up through there. And you have these tube worms that are growing off of that. You even find that anywhere that stinks. If you walk out to a mud flat and smell sulfur, there's probably not a lot of oxygen in that sediment, and so animals can harness bacteria that are doing the same thing. One of my early projects, that is me, that's a very young me, and my friend, and we went out and collected these clams in the Florida Keys. We are 12 miles off the coast, and it's knee deep. That's how flat that area is. And we found these worms, these clams that were hosting these chemosymbionts in their gills. So you can find them in a lot of places. Anywhere there's not a lot of oxygen, you might find chemosynthesis. Another place you find this really cool process is on dead whales. So this brings me to whale falls. Sunken logs can do this too, but they're not cool. Not as cool. Essentially, your bones, the marrow of your bones, has sulfur in it. And if your bone is big enough, like a whale, you could actually support these chemosynthetic organisms that need the sulfur to do their chemosynthesis. And one of the ideas, one of the theories, is that vents are really far apart on the planet, and they're really small, just this big. Maybe a stepping stone to be able to jump from one vent to another are these whale falls. And so animals that are releasing their larvae, they land on one of these whale falls and can make it farther distances, because that's been a question in science is, if it's so unique and so specific, how would you ever make it 1,000 kilometers away? So here's a picture of a whale that's maybe 1 year post-sinking, and you'll see all that red. That red is hemoglobin. Those are the worms that are actually actively hosting those chemosynthetic bacteria, and they're growing up. And they discovered in 2006 at Mbari, Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, where I used to work, these bone-eating worms, which I think have maybe the best scientific name ever. So if you take anything from it, take the scientific name, Osidax muciflorix. Osidax, bone-eating mucus flower. Bone-eating snot flower is a fun way to say. This is the worm. This very carefully was extracted from the bone. This is the colony of bacteria that the worm actually grows around it. So the worm grows into the bone, maybe a vertebrae or a collarbone or something, and inside it's getting to the marrow, which is where the sulfur is. And the bacteria do all the work at the base here and feed both of them. So symbioses are great because the animal provides the home, they provide all the materials they need, and the bacteria does all the work cooking, basically. So they get all the food. All right, so one thing I want to bring up is how much we can change the deep sea environment. We think of it as out of sight, out of mind, and there's nothing more out of sight than the deep sea. It's easier to see the moon than it is to see 2,000 meters depth. And so everything that we're facing in the shallow oceans, things like debris, trash, plastics, those are all finding their way into the deep ocean. Things like climate change and ocean acidification, that's no different in the shallows than it is in the deep. And probably most damaging to the biology down there is overfishing. So overfishing can pull a species down pretty quickly if you take more than they can reproduce. But deep ocean organisms, they don't have a lot of food, and they have extremely long lives. A lot of those fish can be 200 years old. Yeah. So if you take an organism that doesn't reach reproductive maturity until 40, and you fish that out, the species can't come back. right? They just don't make enough of them fast enough. So one of the major problems that we see in taking large fish like tuna and marlin in the shallow ocean that they can't reproduce fast enough is exacerbated with things like orange roughy, which, by the way, its real name was Chilean slimehead, but that doesn't sell well at market, so they called it orange roughy, because that sells better. Also, another problem is that to get a lot of these organisms, they trawl seamounts, and seamounts are areas of higher productivity. There's a lot of coral that lives on that. Believe it or not, coral is more abundant in the deep ocean than it is in the shallows, and they'll drag a big net. This net can be half a mile wide, almost unfathomably large nets, and they'll drag it across the bottom. That coral could be 1,000 years old, gone in a day, and it won't come back. And those environments, once they're changed, it's irrevocable. It's like clear cutting a forest, and the soil goes away. You can't grow those trees back. So one of the big problems is we've done this to so much of the deep ocean anymore, and so legislation needs to be enacted quickly to protect the remaining seamounts that have not yet been attacked. And then finally, one of the most interesting and probably controversial things is, well, these fun devices, right? There's a lot of rare minerals in those. Your electric cars saving the planet, lots of lithium in that. We need to get those minerals somehow. It is challenging to deal with that by just strip mining the planet, and we know how destructive strip mines can be on land. So some companies have said, well, what if we just grab that from the deep sea? So deep sea mining has, in the last 15 years, become a very lucrative market. A lot of companies are going in there and looking for a few things. One, these things called polymetallic nodules that are rocks, they're mostly metal, that are a variable size, about 5 centimeters, so 2 inches to about 10 inches. They're generally spherical, they're located in the abyssal plains, just kind of on the rocks that really, I don't have enough time to go into the chemistry there, but this is probably the least impactful. It would be similar to strip mining the desert. Yes, there will be losses, but it's not a high and rare biodiversity environment. More dangerous, though, are these hydrothermal vent crusts. So all that stuff that's spewing out, rich in rare minerals. And the cobalt-rich crusts are those mid-zone spreading. So a lot of unique organisms live in that, but it's also a rich area for looking for these minerals that we need for all of our phones and cars and TVs and so on. That's what a polymetallic nodule looks like. Here's just a field of them. They form over very, very long periods of time, so you can't think of these as renewable. If you take them out, that's pretty much one source and done. You're going to have to find another one. The machines that do it are truly massive. They are many stories high. My fingernail would be about human height here. So this is about an 8-story tall machine. Brings to mind, I don't know if anybody's seen Fern Gully from 1992 about taking out the rainforest. It kind of reminds me of that. I feel like the engineer of this was like, what if we made that and just put it in the deep sea? And they attach it to a mining support vessel. This is probably 1,000 meters long, similar to the size that just knocked down our bridge, right? So it is pulling the sediment up, and it's separating out all of the sediment from the minerals, right? So it's pretty standard done in mining. You have lots and lots of mud coming out. You don't want that mud. You get rid of it, and you filter down to vanadium, manganese, cobalt, gold, copper, any of these minerals we need for our electronics. They are huge. Yeah, there's a couple people there for size for you. And they're used for different purposes, whether they're looking for those polymetallic nodules or the hydrothermal vents. And it's not sort of a simple question because they are multinational corporations. Canada, Australia are sort of leading the corporation front on them. Both of those countries are really big into mining in general. But the areas that have these rich hydrothermal vent mineral fields don't tend to be around Australia and Canada, so they need to look somewhere else. And so it becomes this neo-colonial capitalist kind of thing because we go to these countries that are relatively poor and say, hey, can we lease mining rights from your waters that you have in your EEZ? And they go, yeah, give us money, we don't really care. And so Tonga, Papua New Guinea, Fiji, these countries have leased their rights to their waters for money so that they can use the minerals so they can be extracted. So it is a really complicated problem. All right, as I said, I'm going to finish with some fun pictures and some interesting stuff. My own interactions with the deep sea. I spent 4 years, 4 years on Atlantis, which is the. If you don't mind, I'm going to have a guest lecturer for now.
Yeah.
This is Austin. So I spent 4 years working on hydrothermal vents on Atlantis off of the Juan de Fuca Ridge, which is this teeny little ridge, a teeny little plate that's smushed between the North American plate and the Pacific plate. It's getting crushed from both sides. A lot of earthquakes over there. And we would collect animals from the ridge. So that is Alvin. It's actually the second gen one. They put a rope down and they pick it up and it brings back in, and then there's this sort of smorgasbord of people running up there to try and grab samples from the front deck. That's actually my PhD advisor there. So we go and grab our animals. They're live at this point, and so I would sort those animals looking for these worms. So you can come up here later and take a look at one of these worms. They're called Paralvanella. They're one of the hottest adapted animals on the planet. They live really close to that really hot fluid that's coming out. And so there's me sorting, and that's a fake photo. They were like, for publicity, they wanted me to take a photo looking under the scope. And I'm like, there are several, I can just sort them by hand. They were like, yeah, but that's not interesting. So here I am pretending to have to sort them under a scope for this day. So I was looking for the sulfancola ones. Those are actually the hotter adapted, and the palmiformis ones are palm worms that were a little bit cooler. And between the two of them, they made a really nice genetic study. So I could talk your ear off about proteomics and genetics and genomics, but I won't. If you want to ask me those questions later, I can. But I was really interested in what genes made an organism extremely tolerant to very, very high heat, hotter than anything on the planet. Desert fire ants are sort of known as the terrestrial champions of this. They couldn't hold a candle to the heat that they deal with. And to do this, we built a system where we had to bring them back to pressure, because one of the things you do as a physiologist is try to generate the system that they're most used to. Of course, they're at pressure, so you bring them up, they're surviving, they're not happy about it, but they're surviving, and you can bring them back to pressure. So it doesn't look quite as clean as my little diagram here, but the animals are actually placed into these little vessels, into a water bath. I use a whole bunch of pumps that are normally used for chemistry. I bring them back to pressure, and then we can do all sorts of science on them. It is a community out there. You have it's a wild time to be at sea for 3 weeks when you are working 18 to 20 hours a day. There is no breaks, but everybody's doing it, and so it feels a bit like a science boot camp. And at the same time, you have people whose pretty much their entire lives are out here. You have engineers, ship captains, cooks, service staff, maintenance people who spend 6 months at sea. And they normally have 12 or 13-hour days, and they don't want to hear any of your science nonsense about being tired, because you get off in 2 weeks and they move on to the next project. And so it's kind of a cool experience of being with both the scientific group and these ship group. There's our science team, there's my PhD advisor. And we have, it's also a nice sort of inter-level educational experience. I was a graduate student at the time, but we had undergraduates with us, we had postdoctorates, we had professors. He was a high school teacher who was coming to sort of broaden education. So it's a nice way to sort of experience science from every level of the educational pathway. There is Alvin itself. It's in its hangar. You can see that's its front deck. I love these boxing gloves. They put those on the manipulator arms to make sure that they don't get injured. But they do have these fun videos of practicing. The pilots and trainers will practice, and they have this punching bag, and they'll make them have to do a series of punches to train to show that they can maneuver the manipulator arms in there. I think this is a picture they used on the front. That's a picture I took of one of the divers. So Alvin will come to the surface and they have, this is totally true, one of my favorite facts about it is they have a phone, a little old payphone style, that has a cord to another phone that's inside the sub. It is 2 cups and a string. There is no electronics to that at all. Why? Because if everything failed and all the electronics failed, you still want to be able to talk to the pilot inside. So you can pull a cord, drop some weights, and then Alvin will just go back to the surface. And occasionally it has lost electronic, maybe 10 dives or so in its 50-year history, but you can just get on the horn and talk to each other and see what's going on and bring it back up. So lots of important fail-safes in there. Life at sea can be a little rough. There were a few days we were in the North Pacific, 30, 40-foot waves coming over the top. But my animals were in my system at the time, so I cinch-strapped myself into my chair along with the animals, and I just sat there and tried to do dissections like this. I still got 10. But yeah, so that was, some days were rougher than others. They have these, they call them Gumby suits because they used to be green. But these are your survival suits, and the first time you get on the ship, they make you dress up with them, mostly to make fun of you with the photo. That was Scott, one of our postdocs, on his first trip there. A couple photos that I took while I was in my dive in Alvin. I had 3 dives over several trips in Alvin. So they have these little windows you can actually take a picture out of. I took a picture of this. We were taking the temperature sample. It's literally just a temperature probe, but it's titanium because the inside of that's about 450 C, or I don't even know what to convert that, 1,000 degrees, very hot in there. We also deployed, that nice picture you saw earlier, this is what actually took that. We deployed this long-term camera thing for a week. We went to the site and put it down for a week, and it took a picture every hour because we were interested in sort of community change. Like, because you go down there, you're only on site for an hour or two before you have to get back to the surface. And so we were like, well, what happens when we leave? So it took 1 photo every hour for a week. And the answer is not a ton happens. But the people that were studying that were really excited. This is me on my very first dive. I am quite a bit tanner and younger in this one. And you have to get up this ladder to get into the sail in there. However, you may or may not know this, just like sailors do with every first that you experience at sea, you have an experience when you come back up. They go, well, you went into a sub, you didn't actually get wet. That's unfortunate. We have to make sure that you get baptized after your first dive. My first dive was a bit weird. It actually was an international incident. My first dive made the international news. And the reason was, right before, in 2008, this happened, a ROV that was owned by Russia went to the North Pole, planted a flag literally at the North Pole on the seafloor and said, this is our ocean now, because they have joint ownership of the Arctic Circle. And Canada was like, no, absolutely not. And in fact, this is our territorial waters. We're kicking everyone out. And at that same time, little did we know, this is a Sunday, we were just in the water, and they were like, absolutely no submarines in the water because Russia just ruined the pool for everybody. And I'm literally sitting in the submarine at 6 in the morning. And they're like, get out, we have to go out. They had to call an ambassador in DC to talk with the ambassador from Canada in DC and get a formal written thing that had to be signed by some Secretary of State to say that this dive could go forward. So I've actually never seen the paperwork, but they assured me there's paperwork saying that my particular dive could go because of that incident. So we got 6 hours late. So I missed dinner, is the only thing that really mattered to me. So they decided that I would get dinner on my baptism. So they came up to me and smashed me in the face with some mashed potatoes and gravy. And then they said, well, we only allow a 2-minute shower, so we'll help you out. And they hit me with 7 buckets of chilled seawater. but they missed once. It's my favorite photo. That's my advisor throwing the bucket at me, and the ship lurched right then. That's me ducking out of the way, Matrix style. Thank you. I'm happy to take, I guess, 10 minutes of questions. Or any? Yeah.
I don't know, seeing something, I think it was called Evolution Earth, it's some, nature documentary recently, and talking about they're discovering on the Earth part of the planet, really rapid evolutionary changes in some species under certain circumstances. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if at the deep, level where there's all these vents and everything else, if anyone is studying like evolutionary changes in any of those organisms.
I'm sure there is. I don't know offhand. I will say one thing that's interesting about the evolutionary rates of change in hydrothermal vents. There is pretty reasonable evidence that the origins of life may come from vents. Because there's the famous Uri experiment in 1950s where they had a bunch of materials in an Erlenmeyer flask and they hit it with lightning. Electricity, and they said, look, we've made some more complicated molecules. And they said, well, because they were trying to find the origins of life. We've never actually synthetically created life. At least that's been publicized, that I know of. But everything you'd need for molecules to become more complicated happen at the vents. You have extreme heat, you have lots of catalytic activity, you have lots of areas for things to evolve, and so you have these two-dimensional plates where a ring of carbons and hydrogens could be made in a circle, which looks very much like an early cell. Because if you make a barrier, things inside could be different than things outside. So the idea of the first cell coming from a hydrothermal vent is pretty well, it's probably the leading theory of the origin of life. It's hard to actually prove anything. So in terms of evolutionary time, it's got a long time at the vents. A lot of the species that you'd find at vents are biologically not much different than you'd find elsewhere. It's only a few genes. Like my thermal tolerance study showed that, that worm is not a lot different than you'd find in any other worm in the ocean, not even that much different than an earthworm. But there's a few things, these specialized areas where selection has to act really fast, because you either can survive high temperature or you can't. So you don't need to make a whole new species if you just need a couple small solutions to that. Yeah.
It's a little probably out of your way, but is anybody studying deep sea smokers, working with NASA to determine, say, like on the ice world with police stuff, that they're going to try to go under the ice to see if there's life under there?
Or IO.
Exists?
Yes, absolutely. And it is out of my way, but I was fortunate enough to be on a research cruise with a group of them. They call themselves the Men in Black, because they're looking for extraterrestrial life. And the best sort of simulacrum that you can find on this planet are hydrothermal vents for exactly those reasons. And so I was out there while a team from NASA, from Ames, which is their advanced microbial environmental center, which is up in NorCal, they were studying what types of chemical reactions happen in biogeochemistry of those conditions so that they could simulate, if we know what creates life here, if we found similar traces in other planets, what might be there. So a lot of the stuff that we're doing with rovers and Mars, when we're looking for that, you're looking for the traces of chemical reactions that would need to be biologically mediated. That, in other words, an animal, well, bacteria probably, would have needed to do that chemical reaction because it's just energetically not feasible without a lot of heat for it to happen just spontaneously. And so we do use hydrothermal vents more than any other environment, but not the only one. They look at hot springs, they look at polar environments as these sort of models for what might be possible. But of course, we don't know until we go. Yeah.
Regarding temperature, you talk a lot about depth and light, but there has to be a huge temperature change as well, the deeper you go.
Yeah.
How can we, I've read that they're trying to utilize that temperature change to create energy.
Mhm.
How would that work? The column of water that would change temperature.
So, I don't know how that would work. So basics of temperature change in the ocean. It happens pretty quickly. There's something called the thermocline, and the thermocline is a pretty. In fact, if you've ever been swimming in a lake, you might have experienced one. If you dove down and suddenly you felt much colder, you'll get this warm layer of water, and warm water is less dense than cold water. And if there's not a lot of mixing, there's not a lot of churn or storms or anything, they can actually start to separate out. Right? You can layer those. And so a thermocline, which exists at about 300 meters or about 1,000 feet depth, you go from the surface temperature down to about 6 degrees centigrade or 45 Fahrenheit pretty quickly. And then it's not that different all the rest of the way down. The deepest part of the ocean is about 2 or 3 Celsius or 36. And it doesn't get colder than that because if it got any colder, it would freeze, and ice is less dense than liquid water, which is the only reason life exists at all. Otherwise, it would fill up. So that starts to rise. So the deepest ocean and 1,000 feet. So the next 30,000 feet, not that much temperature change. It's a big thermocline. So if you wanted to make something that was an energy delta differential, you'd probably want to make something that only needs to transit that. So I feel like you could make a column that goes only about 1,000 feet. You wouldn't need to go into the deep ocean. But why go to the ocean at all? Because geothermal energy on boreholes in land creates even a stronger gradient on land, and you don't need to go into the ocean. So there's a lot of energy gain that can happen from the ocean. A lot of it is more movement based, because if you have, there's another idea for, so tidal energy is you've probably heard of tidal energy, which is basically make a rotor that's in the tide surge and it goes around and around. And similar to a windmill, it's a tide mill. But you can do that in the midwater zone too, because the midwater zone has these fluctuating currents. So if you attach a buoy at the surface to a weight that's in the midwater zone, and that current is going like this, you could generate power that way. So there's I know of a lot of energy research going into these midwater buoys that could set up thing. The problem, of course, is connection. How do you connect that buoy to the earth, to land? And is it even worthwhile? Because if you could put a windmill up on the cliffside and use the generation that way, it's probably less maintenance and easier to get to. So but one of the things that we do think about that for is for open water deployments. If you have long-term research sites, or if you ever want to set up a base or an underwater facility, then they probably would need water-based energy gain assessments.
Well, another question?
Sure.
In the port of Waimea right now is something called a cable layer.
Mm-hmm.
What is the impact of the cables that we have all over the oceans?
Yeah,
on the
so
seafloor?
our first cables were laid in 1870. Those are telegraph cables. And we have been laying cable across the deep ocean since the 1870s, so 150 years of that. It's a lot more than one might even think. We have laid hundreds of thousands of miles, in fact, probably millions of miles of cable now, and most of it gets abandoned. We don't ever pick it back up. So it's gone from telegraph to phone lines to electric cables to fiber optic cables. One interesting fact is the volcanic eruption that happened recently in Tonga just killed all the internet permanently. They have to lay a new cable because it spliced undersea the cable to the island. So the entire island lost all its internet because it was getting it from Fiji. So we have laid all of this cable down there, and it wouldn't be a big deal. The cables are about this thick, and then the protective layer gets about this thick, which isn't huge if you think about how big the ocean is. But the problem is the tension you put on that line makes it start to wave back and forth. So anything that's in the way is scrubbed clean. So if it goes across a deep coral thing, doesn't matter, it's going to be destroyed. So yeah, that is another area of human impact, certainly.
I have an animal question. Those
Sure.
little worms that make those little tubes that they live in,
Yes.
what are they made out of? And has anybody
Great question.
videotaped that?
So they deposit this similar to your hair and your nails. So this material is chitin. So they make these sort of soft tubes, and you can kind of look into them. I encourage you to come up and take a look at them later. They deposit these slowly over time. And you can see these little ridges. They're basically like growth rings. So we can actually age these tubes more or less a year per. So this individual is 70 or 80 for this tube here. This is a different species, but you can see the rings also. So yes, they're biogenic materials, so they're created by the animal itself, and then they hide in them. So the worm itself is about this long, and it can crawl up and down in there. One of the pictures I showed, there were these little scale worms that were crawling on top. They pick at the gills, and so the worm will hide, and then they'll come back out. They breathe through the gills. They can't breathe if they're in here, so they kind of just hide down, and they come back up and they put their gills back in there. They have the symbionts in there.
Okay, next time we want to see that video.
Okay.
I'd love to see that.
One last thing I brought, which is kind of fun. These are styrofoam cups. These are normal size styrofoam cups, but they went down on the outside of Alvin. So this is a great way to show how much pressure happens. So one of the sort of fun things to do as scientists is you draw your fun little scene on the cups, and then they put them in a laundry bag, and they just strapped them to the back of Alvin. They strapped them down so it doesn't get caught in the rotor, but they put it in an outside bag. And one of the fun times is one of the trips I took 2,000 of them that were generated by middle school students from around the area that I was working in. We took 2,000 cups to see with us, and we shrunk them all down so every middle schooler got to take home their cup that they had decorated. There was a lot of SpongeBob on those cups. And then this is my favorite. This was a skull, like a Halloween skull, and I shrank it down, but since there was more styrofoam up here than in the jaw, it made this weird alien-looking skull, but that used to be a styrofoam Halloween skull. So, yeah.
Have you, in any of your dives, encountered any human artifacts, deep sea sounding devices?
The one thing I did see a fair amount of were the weights left by Alvin. So the way that Alvin gets down, in fact most human occupied vehicles, to get down to depth, you are overweighted. By a little bit, not much, but maybe 30 pounds, too much. Now given that that's a 46-ton machine, 30 pounds is really not a lot, but they've really worked out, the engineers have worked out the neutral buoyancy. And so you take these train wheels down, and they leave them because you get down to depth. In fact, you have to stand on a scale on the ship, so no hiding your weight when you're out there. They weigh you, and they get an accurate weight of the 3 people that are inside, the 2 scientists and the pilot, so they can gather how much weight they're going to need to go down. You drop 2 weights. When you get to the bottom, then you're neutrally buoyant. You drop 2 weights at the end of the dive, and you come back. There really isn't an energy efficient way to gather those weights. And so they will go about 300 yards off of where the site is that they want to go to, drop the weight, and then move in. So there's these fields of like slowly rusting iron weights near most of the interesting sites that we haven't really figured out. It's the same problem they have of like oxygen tanks on these tall mountains where people are going up there and they discard their oxygen tank. And so Everest and K2 are littered with those things that occasionally they can go up and clean them, but it's hard to actually do that. But no, I didn't see anything. I will say I used to work for a Bari, and we had a ROV, remote operated vehicle, and my job was basically to catalog everything we saw on cameras, which is dull work usually, but it's pretty cool too. And we were going by, and I saw a plastic chair, a good old lawn chair kind of style, that happened to have landed right side up. And it didn't even it looked like you could just have a seat. So just going along, fish, urchin, worm, chair. Just labeled it chair. Video tagged it. My advisor was like, "That's funny. What is it?" I'm like, "It's a chair." "What is it really?" "I'll show you the timestamp. It's an actual chair." So that was the one time I did see some stuff.
Okay, Mr. Cameron, Is he contributing to science, or is he just making
Yes.
a spectacle of himself?
Yes, also yes.
Okay.
So, James Cameron, plus or minus? Yes, plus. How many of you think about the deep sea? How many did you think about the deep sea after you saw Titanic, or The Abyss, or, you know, Avatar even, right? It brings, even if it's fantastical and definitely egotistical and self-serving, it brings awareness and interest. I tap Avatar in my classes. I show a screen grab and my students go, yeah, I saw that. And then I talk about, well, this is the animal that James Cameron based that off of. So it gives a touchstone point, a cultural touchstone for things that just are out of sight. So anybody that can bring interest and engagement, even if it is fantasy and imagination, I think that's great. Yeah. Now, the fact that he demanded that the entire engineering team build him his own coffin so he could go down to the Mariana Trench to quote, answer the question of were there fish there when we had sent not less than 40 remote operated vehicles to answer that question already, and his answer after was there were no fish there. Yeah. There's some video out there too. He is very good friends with Sylvia Earle, who is probably the hero of the ocean. So if she thinks he's a leader, I'll take that too. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Thanks, assistant.